The style.css is where WordPress looks for themes CSS. It's required by parent and child themes, otherwise WordPress won't think your theme is valid. While it's possible to use a style sheet that isn't style.css for your CSS rules, there still needs to be a style.css in your theme with header information so it displays correctly on the themes page in the WordPress admin. WordPress doesn't have specific requirements for how or if you call style.css. That's left up to the theme developer. For that reason, there are a few different ways you could load your theme style sheet. First off, you can load it in your header.php. There are a bunch of ways of doing this too. Normally, to load a style sheet, you'd use a link tag like this. This loads a style sheet named style.css in the root directory. If I was on mydomain.com, this would look for a style sheet at mydomain.com/style.css. But that's not where our theme lives. Our theme is, usually, in WP Content Themes, theme name. So I could do this manually like this. This works if I'm on the home page, but if I'm on another page and I'm using pretty permalinks, this relative path gets broken. Consider if I was on a page with the slug about. The web server would then look for the style sheet in mydomain.com/about/wp-content/theme/mytheme/style.css, which would result in a 404. So we need to do something to prevent that from happening. The first way of dealing with this is using getBlogInfo. GetBlogInfo allows you to grab some various pieces of information about the site. One of these pieces of information is the site's URL. I could do that like this. This will use the home URL from the general settings page in the WordPress admin. You can also get the same URL by using home URL. But WordPress can be installed in a subdirectory and the links pointed back to the home page. In this case, the style sheet might be in /WordPress/WP-content/theme/mytheme. And if I was looking for it in just WP-content/themes/mytheme on the root domain, I'd get a 404. It's not there. In that case, I can use getBlogInfo WP URL. This looks for the path where WordPress was installed, which is not necessarily the same thing as the site home. But getBlogInfo WP URL will break on multi-site installations that are using paths instead of subdirectories. You could use site URL, which will return the path based on the current site, but this will still break on multi-site, so let's move on. Another option is getBlogInfo style sheet directory. This will return the theme directory, which is the directory of the current theme's style sheet. This function has been replaced, though it's still supported, by getStyleSheetDirectory-URI. For child themes, this will always return the path to the current child themes directory, but sometimes you want to get access to the parent themes directory. For that, you might want to use getBlogInfo template URL. This will always return the URL of the parent theme. If your theme isn't a child theme, it will simply return the theme directory. But if you are using a child theme, it will look at the parent of the active child theme rather than the active themes directory. This function has since been replaced by getTemplateDirectory-URI, which is the better way of doing this. None of these functions give us the actual URL of the style sheet, though. We are still having to add the style.css at the end at the very least. To get the actual URL of the style sheet, you can use getBlogInfo style sheet URL. Now I've got a direct link to the active theme's style.css file. If you wanted to load the style sheet from the parent theme, you'd still need to use getTemplateDirectory-URI and then add a style.css to the end of it. If you're wondering if getBlogInfo style sheet URL has been replaced by another function, you'd be right. GetStyleSheetURI is the replacement function for getBlogInfo style sheet URL. However, style sheets can be added via action hooks that fire when WP head is run too. You can completely remove this link tag in your header and enqueue your style sheet in the functions.php. First, I'll show you how to do this, and then we'll look at it in Museum Core. There are two functions and an action hook that you would need to know about. WP register style, WP enqueue style, and the action hook WP enqueue scripts. It looks like this. What's going on here? Well, first we have a WP register style. This tells WordPress about our style sheet. We're giving it a name, my style, and defining the path to the style sheet, which is the style sheet URI. The next parameter is asking if there are any dependencies for the style sheet. There aren't, so we're saying false. Then it's asking for a version number. This is handy because it gets added to the end of the style sheet URL as a query string, which means that if you're doing development and updating the version, you won't suffer from a cached style sheet if you have some kind of caching enabled. Finally, you can define a media value like print or screen. Next, we're doing a check to make sure we're not in the admin because we don't want to load the style sheet in the WordPress admin. And then we're running WP enqueue style. This actually tells WordPress to load this style sheet when it's loading other style sheets. But now we need to hook the whole thing into a function so WordPress knows when to fire all this. That's where this line, add action WP enqueue scripts load my CSS comes in. Load my CSS is the callback function to run when WordPress fires WP enqueue scripts, which happens inside WP head. Now, with all this, you can load your style sheet from the functions.php rather than manually writing out a link tag. Let's look at a live example. In Museum Core, I have a bunch of style sheets and scripts. They are all loaded essentially the same way. I've wrapped everything in a function called APCore load scripts. And first, we check to make sure we're not in the admin. None of this happens if you're in the WordPress admin. Next, I call in a global is.ie because I've got an IE-only style sheet that I need to deal with later on. Is.ie does a browser check and then returns true if you're using it on a Microsoft browser. Then I load some theme info into a theme variable. You'll see what I do with this later on. WP get theme gets a bunch of information about the theme in a similar way to how get blog info gets information about the site. Then I load in my options. My theme has a bunch of options to use different fonts and different font subsets for non-Latin character support. So if there are any subsets set, we're going to use those, otherwise we'll use the default Latin subset. Then I load a bunch of scripts. WP enqueue script works the same way as WP enqueue style. The first script we're loading, jQuery, is registered inside of WordPress, so I can just load that by itself with no other information. The next one is Bootstrap, and I'm using a shortcut. Rather than registering and then enqueuing, I can actually just enqueue the script or the style without registering it first. WP enqueue script and WP enqueue style take the same number of parameters as WP register script and WP register style, and I'm using this method for both the Bootstrap CSS and JavaScript. Modernizer gets loaded too, but I wrote that first and it's registering the JavaScript before enqueuing it. Next, I register all the fonts, which are hosted on Google, but I'm not enqueuing any of them. You can see that the path to the style sheet is defined and that I'm pulling in that font subset variable to use any specific character set if they've been defined for that font. For the style sheet version, I'm calling in the version of the theme using that theme variable where I store the WP get theme information. After registering all the fonts, I pull in the fonts that were set in the options into an array, and then I run through the array to see which fonts were set and enqueues only those fonts. Then I load a FontAwesome font, which is an icon font that I'm using instead of the Glyphicons font. And this is where I use the IE global, loading an alternate FontAwesome IE style sheet if we're on a Microsoft browser. Finally, I register the main theme style sheet named Core CSS and enqueue that. After all that, if we're on a singular page with comments enabled, I'm enqueuing a built-in WordPress JavaScript to handle threaded comments. All of this is hooked to the WP enqueue scripts action hook. You can still import external style sheets within style sheets too. In the case of Museum Core, that might be one way I could have loaded the Bootstrap and FontAwesome CSS files. But I chose to do it the other way, so all my style sheets are loaded in the same place, and loading CSS files inside of other CSS files might not get the benefit of having other plugins minify the CSS before outputting it. That's how you load the CSS in WordPress. Actually, writing the CSS itself is a course and an art in itself, and if you need a refresher or an introduction on CSS, I recommend trying one of these other Pluralsight courses by some great authors. Just because WordPress is centered around the style.css in the theme's root directory doesn't mean that that's what you need to do in your theme. I said you need to have a style.css, but you don't need to be using the style.css in your theme. It can be there just for the theme header if you want it to be. You can instead load your CSS from somewhere else. In Core, I'm doing it with the Bootstrap and Font Awesome CSS files, but if you wanted to load your main CSS file in an assets subdirectory, you can do that instead. If you're putting the link tag in your header.php, you just want to use getStyleSheetDirectory URI or getTemplateDirectory URI to load the path to the theme, and then append the path to your style sheet after that. Or if you're loading the CSS in the functions file, you can just enqueue the style sheet at its actual path and never use the style.css. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this if you're planning on distributing your theme. It might still be accepted in the WordPress.org repository, but it kind of goes against the intent of WordPress and its philosophy toward open source, which is to create things that other people can look at and learn from. The standard and the expectation for WordPress themes is to use style.css for all your CSS, and if you're not doing that, it could be confusing to newer developers. But if you're building a theme for a client and it's not for distribution, this could be a good way to partially mask the platform, if that's your thing, or just make things more standard for your own work environment, if that kind of directory structure is more what you're used to.